Welcome back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. Still in Nigeria, not less than 2.2 million improperly registered SIM cards have been disabled by the Federal Ministry of Communications.
That's right. Well, the blocked telephone lines are among the 9.2 million lines the ministry threatened to block if not properly registered on or before last Wednesday. Now, the minister, Patanmi, has praised the NCC for its prompt action in reducing the number of improperly registered SIM cards within 1 week. Now, joining us in the studio is CEO of Alpha African Advisory, Sanyade Okolie, and she joins us here for more on this. Welcome. More than 2.2 million SIM cards. It's a lot to cut. What do you think the implications are?
Well, let's step back. If we think about it, the number of registered lines we have in Nigeria now is about 170 million. So the 2.2 is a little over 1%, so it's not huge. But it's something, as you know, we've been grappling with over the years. So if you cast your mind back to 2015, when MTN got slammed a huge fine of just about 1 trillion naira then. Eventually they negotiated and got down to about 330 billion. But that was because MTN had about 5.2 million unregistered SIM cards. So compare that to the 2.2 we're talking about, it shows, for the entire industry, it shows progress.
So what are the main benefits of having this SIM card, as it were?
Well, the concern with unregistered SIM cards really is security. So basically you have kidnappers and some of the internet, the online fraudsters using these lines, and obviously you can't trace them to who it belongs to. And it makes it easier for them to get away with it. So the key issue they're trying to deal with here is security.
And still talking about that, Femi, the issue of bank frauds, whereby people send text messages and they try to replicate, the banking industry.
Yes.
I've been in scenarios like that when you go back to the bank and they tell you, no, we didn't send that. So
I think if everybody just takes the view that banks do not send unsolicited texts with strange numbers. If you think about it, when you get a message from your bank, it would say the bank's name, UBA, Zenith Bank, etc. So if it's from an unfamiliar number, I think you could pretty much say it's not a legitimate text.
Yeah, very good. But there are issues sometimes where they just put the names of the bank there, and you've had to okay, fine, take a step back, ask the bank people, and they tell you, oh, we didn't actually send that. Yeah. Probably someone did.
So again, take the banks keep saying, we're not going to ask you for your PIN number, we're not going to ask you for any sensitive information in that form. And if in doubt, contact the bank rather than respond to the email directly. That's my own security views.
I know you said that while 2.2 million, in terms of, if we put it in context, isn't much more than 1%. Yeah. In that case, do you think that these measures are good for security? Do they actually make a difference?
Well, only the security expert can tell us. But what you will have to admit is that the fewer unregistered lines you have, the harder it is for the hijackers, the kidnappers, etc., to perpetrate. It's not, as criminals will always look to circumvent. So it just means that they have to raise the level of their criminality. But at least let's just deal with some of these basic things.
Talking about dealing with some of these basic issues, in terms of regulation, the NCC has come up with various policies, and probably this is one of it. So how would you rate their own activities in the sector so far?
Well, let's just look over the long period of time, I guess 15, 18 years, however long we've had certainly the mobile industry going. And you could argue that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If you think of the number of registered lines, we just said 172 million over under 20 years. For a country such as Nigeria, where we're not a high-income country, if you look at the mobile phone penetration, that is a remarkable achievement.
Indeed.
And then we've also, even from a customers to a consumer standpoint, so many issues that have been identified over a period of time, NCC has taken steps to try and address. So, for example, the period where customers had concerns about the value-added services that were being pushed, that's been addressed, certain unsolicited text, they took steps to address it.
True.
So I think overall NCC certainly comes up for, it's done well.
Keeping them on their toes, as it were.
I mean, if we were to look at the network providers themselves, what role do you think they played in these changes here?
Well, of course, they've had to be equally responsive, and there's nothing like being given a $5 billion fine to, clear the mind, shall we say. Obviously, that was addressed. They managed to reduce the fine. Still a huge hit to both the profitability of MTN here in Nigeria, but also affecting the MTN group and share price, et cetera, and other operators would look at that and think, it's not worth the headache for themselves. So yeah, overall, I think the industry as a whole has accomplished a lot.
Indeed. I'd like you to hold your thoughts on that while we go to another story where Nigeria's current account deficit increased to 876 billion naira at the end of the second quarter of 2019.
That's according to data from the Central Bank of Nigeria. The current account deficit occurs when a country's foreign liabilities exceed its foreign assets. It's exacerbated when the country imports more than it exports. Sanyade is still with us on this story.
Very good. Now, what factors led to our foreign liabilities exceeding foreign assets? We've talked about policy issues every now and then.
As you said there, we're looking at current account deficit. We're looking really at import versus export. And this is a topic that we've discussed several times here on this show. If we look at export, given that Nigeria's biggest export is actually oil, then it really is to do with what oil price is doing. On the import standpoint, reading the report, they're talking about a lot of one big, user of our foreign exchange has actually been transportation and travel and people traveling. But I saw an interesting piece there that said that even when we have the people emigrating out of Nigeria to countries such as Canada, they're saying people actually emigrated to Canada from Nigeria. But the relevance here is they sell property and all the assets they have, convert it into foreign exchange and take it out of the country. So, you don't, obviously in the grand scheme of things, it's not huge, but it is a form of, so we've been thinking about the human capital flight, but then it is also economic capital leaving Nigeria. So I just thought that was an interesting point.
It is.
All right. In such a scenario, what about diaspora funding? Those who are there sending money back as well? Is it just a small margin? Or a drop in the ocean, as it were?
Well, certainly, diaspora money coming into Nigeria is significant. It remains significant. But you also always have to remember that where are the people? So when we talk about diaspora, where are the countries they're in and what is going on in those economies? So if we take the UK, for example, with Brexit and all the issues there, it's bound to affect the Nigerians in the UK's ability to be able to repatriate funds here to Nigeria.
If we go back to the deficit, I mean, I guess it's obvious to us, but if we were to talk about the impact on the economy, what does that have?
So the current concern is actually possible devaluation. Because if you actually look at the trend of Nigeria's current account deficit, the last time you had significant deficits was around the sort of 2015, 2016 when oil prices went down and we ended up indeed having to devalue the naira. So this is essentially fanning the flames and the concerns about whether or not there's another devaluation is imminent.
Well, devaluation is usually the easiest way out, when it comes to scenarios such as this. So, and of course, we always get that kind of advice also from the international lenders, as it were. So, could there have been something else we could, put on the table here the long term? I'm
sure the CBN governor will take exception to using the term the easiest way out, because devaluation is never an easy way out. And I think the President Buhari has made his stance quite clear that he really does not like devaluation. So by the time the CBN governor announces that, you know that they really feel like it is the only way out.
back to the deficit. Do you think the government or anybody is doing enough to address the issue of high importation?
I like the fact that you said anybody, because
Yes.
this morning I was at my one child's school, and they had the sort of Independence Day show, etc. And one of the ones that hit me is where they had a little skit with the children, just throwing litter, fighting over market space, etc., etc. And the point that we're making is that all too often in Nigeria we blame government. But there's so many areas that actually government is not responsible. We have to take individual responsibility. So I'll put it to you. What individual responsibility are you taking about the amount of imported goods and products that you use and consume versus locally made Nigerian? Because I think it really is a mindset shift where we as Nigerians say, my handbag, my clothes, my food, etc., etc., am I buying locally? Or am I still dependent on imports?
And just before you came in, we had
talk about
rice, and
Yes.
there's been a shift of patronage now to the domestic made rice, and so I was asking him then, was it worthwhile? So what are your thoughts on that?
My
on
view
the ban on closure of the border.
Well, that one we spoke about last week, and I said that
Yeah.
there are many things to consider.
Yeah.
So, yes, it may have, ensure that a greater shift towards local consumption of rice, reduction in the import of petroleum products, etc. But the other side, you do have trade agreements that are essentially being flouted,
True.
and that sense of uncertainty that it brings, certainly for investors, where they feel that they never know. It's always this question of what next. So that's on that. But to the whole point of imports, the reality is it will require some level of discomfort from all of us in the short term. But I think it is very much worthwhile because we need to wean ourselves off so many imported products.
Indeed.
It's just not sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, and looking inwards, I think,
Yeah.
is the key to a large extent at this rate. Sanyade Okolie, always a pleasure to have you. Many thanks.
Thank you.
All right, you're still on to Global Business Report here on the Rise. News soon to come. Struggling fashion retailer Forever 21 files for bankruptcy protection with plans to restructure business. Details in a moment. Stay with us.